All right, so now we're going to be talking about the unit circle and we're going to be focusing on family member angles, which is how we're going to go about taking what we learned about quadrant one and use it to learn about angles in the other three quadrants. So the definition of a family member angle is its angles in different quadrants whose nearest angle to the x-axis match. So for example, if you've got an angle theta in quadrant one that looks like that, its family member in quadrant two looks like this. So the angle it makes with the closest part of the x-axis is still theta, but because that's not how we usually measure angles in the unit circle, we have to measure going counterclockwise from the positive x-axis. We're going to say that it actually has a measure of 180 minus theta. Family member in quadrant three looks like this. That has a measure of 180 plus theta. And the family member in quadrant four looks like this, and that has a measure of 360 minus theta, because you have to go almost all the way around the circle. And even though these angles are in different quadrants, if you were to draw that perpendicular line to the x-axis, you would get the same triangle as you got in quadrant one. It would just be oriented a little bit differently. So you're going to end up getting the absolute value of the x and y values the same in all of these. So let's remember that the cosine of the angle is the x value where it intersects the circle, and the sine is the y value where it intersects the circle. So that means that in quadrant two, the cosine is now going to be the negative of whatever it was in quadrant one. The sine is positive. It's exactly the same as it was in quadrant one. In quadrant three, cosine and sine are both negative. And in quadrant four, the cosine is positive and the sine is negative. So if we know about the quadrant one family member and we know which quadrant we're in, we can find the sine and the cosine of an angle in any quadrant. So for example, let's have a look at the 30-degree family. So in quadrant one, the cosine of 30 degrees is square root 3/2, and the sine of 30 degrees is 1/2. In quadrant two, you do 180 minus 30 is 150 degrees for the quadrant two family member. That means that the cosine of 150 degrees is negative square root 3/2, and the sine of 150 degrees is still positive 1/2. In quadrant three, you do 180 plus 30 is 210. Cosine of 210 is negative square root 3/2. Sine of 210 degrees is negative 1/2 because cosine and sine are both negative in quadrant three, and we're still in the 30-degree family. And in quadrant four, you do 360 minus 30 is 330 degrees. So the cosine of 330 degrees is the square root of 3/2, and the sine of 330 degrees is negative 1/2, because now the cosine is positive and the sine is negative. So once again, being able to know the quadrant one family member and know what quadrant we are in, we can find the cosine and the sine of an angle anywhere in the circle. Another thing that's really useful to note here if you're working in radians, 30 degrees is pi over 6, 150 degrees is 5 pi over 6, 210 is 7 pi over 6, and 330 is 11 pi over 6. Every single one of these, the pi over 6 family, has a denominator of 6 in simplest form. And that's going to be true no matter what family you're looking at. So if you're looking at the pi over 4 family, they'll all have a denominator of 4 in simplest terms. Pi over 3 family all has a denominator of 3 in simplest terms. So if you're working in radians, that's a handy little shortcut for figuring out which family you're looking at, and from there you just have to figure out which quadrant you're in.